Why Africa's United States failed miserably. In 1847, a small country on the west coast of Africa declared independence and handed its founders a brand new constitution. It had a Senate and a House of Representatives, a president with executive power, a Supreme Court, and a Declaration of Rights that opened with the words, "All men are born equal," a preamble that began, almost word for word, with "We the people." The country was called Liberia. It was the first democratic republic in Africa, and it was modeled deliberately and explicitly on the United States of America. It ended in one of the worst civil wars of the 20th century, with an estimated 200,000 people dead, 1 million displaced, entire villages erased from the map, and a warlord who openly admitted to killing civilians winning a democratic election because voters were too afraid of what he'd do if he lost. The story of how Liberia got from that constitution to that civil war is the story of what happens when you export the structure of a democracy without exporting any of its underlying principles. To understand Liberia, we have to go back to 1808. The United States had just banned the slave trade. Not slavery itself, just the transportation of enslaved people from Africa. The country now contained a significant population of freed Black Americans, formerly enslaved people and their descendants, who had been in America for generations but existed in a society that had no clear place for them. A coalition of people with very different motivations came up with the same answer: send them to Africa. Abolitionists saw it as a path to freedom. Black nationalists saw it as an opportunity for self-determination. Slave owners saw it as a way to reduce the free Black population they found threatening. In 1816, the American Colonization Society was formed to make it happen, drawing support from major political figures including Presidents James Madison and James Monroe. Congress contributed $100,000 to fund the venture. In 1822, the first ship landed off the West African coast carrying 86 settlers. Over the following decades, more followed, buying and sometimes seizing land from local tribes along a narrow coastal strip. The settlement at Cape Meserado was renamed Monrovia, after President Monroe. By 1836, these scattered coastal outposts were consolidated into the Commonwealth of Liberia. And from the very beginning, who Liberia was actually for was clear. Article 13 of its new constitution stated it plainly. The great object of forming these colonies is to provide a home for the dispersed and oppressed children of Africa. Only persons of color shall be admitted to citizenship. That meant the American and Caribbean settlers and freed slaves brought from captured slave ships. The millions of indigenous Africans already living in the territory did not qualify. This group, known as the Americo-Liberians, made up roughly 5% of the total population. They would control almost everything for the next 133 years. The system they built borrowed the form of American democracy without the substance of it. The true Whig Party, named after the American Whigs and using an elephant as its symbol, held uninterrupted power for over a century. Elections were held regularly. Opposition parties technically existed. In practice, the outcome of every election was decided before a vote was cast. Opposition candidates were harassed, jailed, and occasionally attacked. Both newspapers in the country were government-owned. Court rulings inconvenient to the ruling party were simply ignored. In 1927, President Charles D.B. King won re-election with 230,000 votes. In a country where only around 19,000 people were legally eligible to vote, that's a victory margin of 1,210%. The indigenous population, around 95% of Liberia's people, existed in a parallel system. The interior, referred to as the hinterland, was governed by president-appointed paramount chiefs working alongside Americo-Liberian commissioners. Effectively, a separate legal and economic system operating inside the same country. Native land rights were not recognized. A hut tax forced rural communities to pay in cash or labor, collected by armed frontier troops who often sustained themselves by raiding the very villages they were supposed to govern. The few concessions to inclusion were mostly cosmetic. When the Constitution expanded voting rights in 1945, the 3 interior provinces received 6 seats out of 39 in the House of Representatives. The wealth flowing out of the hinterland in the form of land, labor, rubber, and iron ore went almost entirely in one direction, toward the coast, toward the Americo-Liberian elite. toward the foreign companies like the Firestone Tire Company, whose rubber plantations were already consuming significant chunks of the country. The arrangement worked, in the way that arrangements built on total control usually work. Until it didn't. The first crack appeared in 1979 over rice. President William Tolbert, the Americo-Liberian successor to long-serving reformist William Tubman, raised the price of rice by 50%. The stated reason was to encourage domestic production. The actual context was that Tolbert's family controlled the rice import monopoly. Student protests erupted almost immediately and spread into nationwide riots. Cities burned. Tolbert called in the military. Less than a year later, Tolbert was shot dead in his residence. 13 members of his government were publicly executed on the beach in Monrovia. The man who ordered it was a 28-year-old master sergeant named Samuel Doe, the first indigenous Liberian ever to hold power. His government was drawn almost entirely from disgruntled tribal members who had been allowed into the armed forces but never into anything above it. Many Liberians, exhausted by 133 years of Americo-Liberian dominance, were cautiously hopeful. What they got was a rerun of everything they had just escaped, just with different beneficiaries. Doe's Kron ethnic group replaced the Americo-Liberian at the top of the patronage network. Government positions, military promotions, and economic opportunities flowed to Kron loyalists. Other groups, particularly the Geo and Mano, were persecuted for alleged involvement in a failed 1985 coup attempt. The coup's leader, Thomas Kwiwankpa, was publicly mutilated and his body dragged through the streets of Monrovia. The names at the top had changed, the structure beneath them had not. By 1989, the conditions were exactly right for the next catastrophe. Charles Taylor, a half Americo-Liberian who had worked in Doe's government before fleeing to the United States, accused of embezzling $900,000, had spent the intervening years training in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. He entered Liberia from Côte d'Ivoire on Christmas Eve 1989, leading a force called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia through Nimba County, where the populations most victimized by Doe's regime welcomed him as a liberator. What followed over the next 14 years was not a war in any conventional sense. It was a sustained collapse of everything that makes a society function. An estimated 200,000 people were killed, roughly 10% of Liberia's entire population. 1 million were displaced. Entire villages were razed. Ethnic divisions that the one-party system had suppressed became the defining fault lines of the conflict. The NPFL splintered, with factions forming and reforming along tribal loyalties, eventually producing 7 separate armed groups fighting across the country simultaneously. The conflict's most documented legacy was the systematic use of child soldiers, with children as young as 7 recruited, drugged, and used as frontline fighters by multiple factions. Doe himself never made it out of his executive mansion in Monrovia. He left briefly to visit the ECOWAS peacemaking base and was captured by INPFL forces loyal to a rival warlord named Prince Johnson. What happened next was filmed. Doe was tortured, mutilated, had his ears cut off while Johnson sat nearby drinking beer, and was eventually killed. The footage circulated widely. Johnson was later elected to the Liberian Senate and served until his death in 2024. The ECOWAS finally brokered enough ceasefires to hold a credible election in 1997. Liberia made a choice that made perfect sense given everything it had just lived through. It elected Charles Taylor with 75% of the vote, the man who had started the Civil War, the man whose forces had committed documented atrocities, the man responsible for a significant portion of the 200,000 dead. One of his campaign slogans captured the logic precisely. He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I'll still vote for him. It wasn't enthusiasm, it was calculation. Voters understood that Taylor was the only person capable of ending the war, because he was the only person powerful enough to have kept it going. Voting for anyone else risked more violence. Taylor governed exactly as everyone who had paid attention should have expected. Political freedoms were curtailed. Ethnic favoritism was returned. The economy, already shattered, continued to deteriorate. And Liberia slid back into conflict within 5 years, this time attacked from the north by a new rebel group with exactly one policy: Taylor must go. By 2003, the pressure was enough. Taylor fled to Nigeria. 3 years later, he was captured at the Nigerian border trying to escape and became the first head of state since Nuremberg to be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, partly for his role in Liberia's conflict and partly for his support of Sierra Leone's blood diamond trade. He is currently serving a 50-year sentence in a British prison. The full arc of Liberia's history from 1847 to 2003 follows a pattern so consistent it becomes almost predictable in retrospect. The Americo-Liberian elite built a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of 5% of the population and called it a republic. When that system collapsed, the groups that replaced it did not dismantle the structure. They occupied it. The Kron under Doe, the Geo and Mono under various NPFL factions, the Mandingos and Loas in later conflicts. Every group that gained power used it the same way the true Whig Party had, to reward its own and exclude everyone else. This is the real failure of the Liberian experiment. It was not that the American constitutional model was wrong for Africa, it was that the model was never actually applied. What Liberia built was the aesthetic of American democracy, the branches of government, the elections, the declarations of rights, sitting on top of an ethnic patronage system that was incompatible with every principle those documents claim to represent. Liberia today remains the poorest country on the West African coast by per capita income, lower even than neighbors who went through their own catastrophic conflicts. Since 2006, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became Africa's first elected female head of state, the country had made genuine progress toward stability. The Constitution has been rewritten. Elections have been meaningfully contested. The peace has held. But the distance between where Liberia started and where it could have been after 175 years is a measure of what the original betrayal actually cost. A country founded on the promise that all men are born equal spent its first century and a half proving, methodically and deliberately, that it didn't mean it. If Liberia surprised you, the history of how democracy gets exported and distorted is one of the most important stories of the modern world. Subscribe for the political history that schools summarize in a paragraph, and we spend an entire video on.